A reading from the Gospel according to Luke, chapter 13, verses 10 through 17. Listen for a good word from the Lord. Now Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, and just then there appeared a woman with a spirit that had crippled her for 18 years. She was bent over and was quite unable to stand up straight. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said, "Woman, you are set free from your ailment." When he laid hands on her, immediately she stood up straight and began praising God. But the leader of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had cured on the Sabbath, kept saying to the crowd, "There are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be cured, and not on the Sabbath day." But the Lord answered him and said, "You hypocrites! Does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and lead it away to give it water? And ought not this woman, a daughter from Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 long years, be set free from this bondage on the Sabbath day?" When he said this, all his opponents were put to shame, and the entire crowd was rejoicing at the wonderful things that he was doing. This is the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. Thanks be to God. Lately, I've been blessed to be part of premarital coaching processes with couples that are preparing to get married. I've been having more of these conversations lately in the years past, which is wonderful. I'd rather do premarital coaching and weddings than funerals any day. Now, some of these couples are coming off of a COVID delay of sorts. The pandemic hindered their timing, and they're finally able now to gather their families and friends in celebration of their covenant with one another and with God. Premarital coaching and counseling is an important part of the wedding preparation process. It may not seem like it to some, but I believe it may be at least as important as the venue, the dress, the flowers, and the food and band for the reception. It might even be more important than the ceremony itself, as the couple considers why they're even getting married and what they see as necessary to have a successful marriage, and what might stand in the way of that along their journey together, and what strategies might they put into place that will allow them to overcome the obstacles and challenges that will inevitably come their way in their life together. Now, they may watch their wedding video every anniversary, but the strategies they begin to utilize each day as a couple before their ceremony even takes place will continue to be used on a daily basis until death shall part them. In the first session of the process, you always want to get to know the couple better. How did they meet and fall in love? What is it about the other person that they love most and that makes them most excited about their future together? You also want to know just how much they know about each other and what has made them who they are. What experiences have shaped them? What strengths did the other person bring to the relationship? In particular, emphasis is always given to how much they know about each other's family of origin. After all, and like it or not, when you marry someone, you marry their family as well. How does their understanding of the families from which they come shape their ideals of the family that they want to be together? So I'll often ask the bride to tell me about the groom's family and vice versa. What do they know about them? What aspects really define their family and have shaped their soon-to-be covenant partner as a result? What you love and respect about the family that you hope to include in your family as it develops and grows after the wedding? And most of the time, the person whose family is being described nods in agreement. They agree on what they've said. They've been together long enough that they have a clear sense of the family and what makes them uniquely them. Every now and then, however, something will be said that leads to an interesting conversation, perhaps even debate, about how their family should be defined. I wonder if that isn't something similar to what we have here in the 13th chapter of the Gospel of Luke, when Jesus serves as a guest preacher in one of the synagogues on one Sabbath day. He has his own family of origin, just as everyone gathered there that day would have. He was shaped by his mother, his earthly father, and his brothers and sisters, just like everyone else. He also knew that they were all part of one greater family. They had a shared story and family of origin that defined them. They had a shared calling and purpose into which they were all meant to live. They were children of Abraham. descendants of the one called out as the father of God's chosen, a people to be set apart, to be an example to the world, and to be the ones through whom God would bless the entire world. In order to maintain their example, they had to live differently than the rest of the world lived. They needed to show the world a better way to be than most of them were living. They needed to show the world what it looks like to live life on God's terms instead of on those set by the powers and the principalities of this world. They had a covenant as a family, a covenant with God and with each other, and it needed to be maintained. And here in this passage, we get to peer into a moment in which the defining aspects of what made the greater Jewish family what God wanted it to be were under debate. On the one hand, we have the law, the Torah, the set of 613 rules and commandments that the people were expected to follow. What does it look like to be a son or daughter of Abraham? Well, in this camp, it's simple. You follow the rules. That is how the family is defined. That is how you make sure your life looks different from others and you point others toward God. You live out the law to every jot and tittle, every day, no expectations. On the other hand, you have the Spirit at work behind the letter of the law. You have an understanding that it isn't enough to simply follow the rules for their own sake. No, if you're truly going to be a son or daughter of Abraham, you must be faithful in fully reflecting the very nature of the one who established the covenant with Israel in the first place. You must be faithful in living into and out of the very nature of God. And only by living out the law in a way that reflects the very nature of God does one start to live out the heart of the family. The specific question on the table right here is about how one understands and lives out the rules and teachings on the Sabbath. Sabbath keeping is and was an important way to distinguish oneself from the rest of the world. The Hebrew word for Sabbath, Shabbat, literally means to stop. Stop working for one day a week. Rest and worship instead. Now, this was extraordinary. There was no other culture at the time that had such a practice. It was foreign to the rest of the world. It made no sense to them. It might still not today. Well, how do you faithfully keep the Sabbath? You stop and rest from work and labor. The rest of the world may be built on a value system rooted in production and profit, but a covenant with God is based on something else entirely. A covenant with God isn't based on working as much as you can and staying as busy as you can to be able to consume as much as you can or to do anything you can to earn God's favor. A covenant with God is based first and foremost on the fact that God is God and we are not. That God's created and loved world goes on without our production because God is at the center of it, not us. It is based on the fact that God has gifted us to partner with God in caring for creation and each other, but our gifts are finite. Ultimately, we must orient ourselves toward God, who can do everything that we can't. And it's based on a pattern of creation outlined in Genesis where God created in 6 days, and yes, it tells us on the seventh day, God rested. As Will Willimon wrote it, Sabbath keeping is a publicly enacted sign of our trust that God keeps the world, therefore we do not have to. God welcomes our labors, but our contributions to the world have their limits. And if even God trusted creation enough to be confident that the world would continue while God rested, Willimon wrote, so should we. So Sabbath keeping, stopping from work and production, becomes an act of faith and worship to a holy God. It was so important for the people of Israel to understand this that it was codified into law. It is among the top 10 commandments, as you probably know. It is number 4 to be exact. In Exodus 20, we read, "Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. You, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, but rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it." keep the Sabbath. It is holy. It's good for God. It was good for us. It was good then. It's good now. And in overworked and overconnected and toxically busy lives, it can be downright necessary. Stop working and finding your identity in what you do. Rest and worship, finding your identity in a relationship with God. But it isn't just that you should rest. Anyone and anything that works for you should rest too. And anyone in your midst that could be oppressed by a system that requires constant work should be allowed to rest as well, because that isn't a system based on God. Keeping Sabbath is a holy act of faith to a holy God, so keep Sabbath. It's a good rule. But any rule can be manipulated. Any law can be found to have a loophole or some way of getting around it or abusing it. So the rabbis, the scribes, and the teachers of the law debated what actually constituted work that should be stopped. They came up with lists of what you could do and not do and still be considered living inside the law. They taught them to the people and tried to hold the people accountable according to those lists. Clearing a field to get ready for the next planting season. Well, that's pretty obviously work. It's a future investment of sorts in a society driven by an agrarian economy, so don't do it. But what about starting a fire to keep the children from freezing in the dead of winter? Don't go into the marketplace on the Sabbath and engage in commerce that requires someone else to work for you or on your behalf on the Sabbath. Okay, that might be a given. But what about saving someone from drowning? It's physical exertion of my body. It's work to be sure, but is it work to be avoided on the Sabbath? And it can get quite nuanced. Save the life of a fellow Jew, that's okay, but what about a Gentile? So there were lists of what was considered work to be stopped on the Sabbath and what was permitted based on circumstance. And at some point, in the midst of those debates and making all of those lists, it seems almost simply human to forget the purpose of the rule to begin with. Exodus 20 isn't the only place where Sabbath is talked about in the Hebrew Scriptures. The commandment to keep the Sabbath returns in the book of Deuteronomy. It is there in chapter 5 that Moses reminds the people of Israel once again that they should observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy as the Lord your God commanded you. He says again, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male or female slave or your ox or your donkey or any of your livestock or the resident alien in your towns, so that your male and female slave may rest as well as you. The difference here is that a different justification is then given for the Sabbath rule. It isn't just that the day is holy because God is holy and God rested. No, Moses is remembered as adding, remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. Now, I read from this vantage point, the Sabbath isn't just about reorienting ourselves to God's holiness. It isn't just about stopping our work because it is good for us and everyone else, and because it sets up a life through healthy, God-centered weekly patterns. In this case, it's about gratitude for what God has done. It is about reflecting the nature of a liberating God, a God who sets the world free and desires abundant life for all. The Sabbath is about freeing ourselves and others from the burdens that enslave us, just as God freed the Israelites from the burdens of Egyptian bondage. The Sabbath is about liberation, not simply about limits and controls on what you can and cannot do and still be considered faithful. It is about liberation and grace, not legalism. Therefore, it is liberation, not legalism, that will define what it means to be a son or a daughter of Abraham, a child of God. At least that's what it seems to have meant to Jesus. At some point during his teaching in the synagogue, Jesus sees a woman who is bent over and unable to stand up straight. She has been in that position for 18 long years. If you've ever experienced any kind of back pain, just imagine how excruciating this must have been for her. In addition to the physical limitations, imagine how this must have kept her at the edge of society, how others must have overlooked her and walked past her, ignoring her as they went about their days. it's not much of a way to live. Not only is she limited, she is mostly unseen. But Jesus sees her. The scholars, commentators, and preachers are quick to point out that this woman didn't ask for anything, at least not according to Luke. If there was a disruption to the tradition of the Sabbath worship that morning, it was caused by Jesus, not this woman. Unlike other moments in the Gospels, she doesn't beg Jesus for help. Others don't even intercede on her behalf. She doesn't cry out with demonic possession asking, "What will Jesus do with them?" She doesn't even ask to be healed. I mean, regardless of her beliefs about the Sabbath and whether or not healing would have been violated the Sabbath's law, she doesn't ask Jesus to do anything for her. Maybe it's because she'd suffered and been so isolated for so long that she had given up hope that anyone ever could or would do anything to heal her. But Jesus sees her. He sees her condition as a physical representation of the powers of evil at work in the world, and he is moved with compassion for her. Perhaps he's even moved by anger at the state of a broken world. Perhaps he wants to give this woman and everyone else a taste of something better, a foretaste of what God will eventually do when every hurt is healed and every tear is dried. So he heals her. He liberates her from her physical and spiritual burdens. Woman, you are set free from your ailment. She stands up straight for the first time in 18 years. And everyone must have been amazed, but not everyone was happy about it. The leader of the synagogue in particular seems to feel the need to take back control of the worship service. He admonishes the people by telling them that this wasn't the time for healing, but for worship. In his mind, healing was an act of work, not of worship. And that happened on other days. The synagogue was closed for healing business on the Sabbath, according to him. In Jesus' mind, however, it seems that doing something to liberate someone from the things that have burdened them is about as close to the heart of God as you can get. And it is then, by definition, worship. What's worse is that in Jesus' mind, the synagogue leader's insistence on a particular kind of Sabbath observance, well, it makes him a hypocrite. Jesus knew he would have pulled his ox out of a ditch if it is stuck there. And that's, by physics, as much work as anything could be. But his own cultural sister, this daughter of Abraham, wasn't worth unburdening in his eyes. His legalism got in the way of God's liberation until Jesus offered a different path. Jesus shows us the heart of God. And God desires abundant life for all God's children. And God gives the Sabbath law and all other laws in order to ensure abundant life for all, especially those who have been burdened by physical ailments or by human oppression. And when it comes to liberating and ensuring abundant life, God is not closed for healing business on the Sabbath or any other day for that matter. Now, Fred Craddock once wrote, "It is possible to get an A in Bible and still flunk Christianity." Well, the synagogue leader obviously wasn't trying to ace Christianity, but he certainly missed the point of his faith, at least in Jesus' eyes. He got mad about the wrong thing. He got mad that worship was disrupted. He got mad that it looked like a healing type of work was being done that day. He could have gotten mad that he lived in a world where this woman was forced to exist in excruciating pain and isolation for so long without any relief. And he could have then been moved to act on that instead. But in the end, we're left with an image of a healed and fully restored, upright, standing child of God and a would-be religious referee bent over in shame that he missed the call. God wants to offer liberation and healing to all, no matter the burden. And God never says, "Come back tomorrow. We're closed for business on the Sabbath." God says, "Come and lay your burdens down today." As the Ben Rector song says, "Go on, lay your troubles down. Set your feet on solid ground. Peace deep as I have found, I want to follow you. Come on, all you weak and weary. Come round now if you can hear me. Poor, sick, and God-fearing, I want to follow you. Leave all of your trouble. Leave all your sorrow. Set down your burden. Come and follow. Come on, heavy laden. Don't wait for tomorrow. Come on, my brother. Come on and follow. Go on, leave your worries too. Not a bit of good they do. There's a word that's coming through. Go on, leave your worry too. So I call your name in the middle of the night. I want to know, can you hear my cries? June heat and moonlight, I want to follow you. Leave all your trouble. Leave all your sorrow. Set down your burden. Come and follow. Come on, heavy laden. Don't wait for tomorrow. Come on, my brother. Come on and follow. Set your burdens down. If you are burdened today, you need to know that whatever burden you have, whatever anyone else says about it, God desires to carry it with you and, when possible, heal you of it. And as a church, we must remember that we are called to pattern our lives and our collective work after the God who liberated the Israelites from Egypt, who sent Jesus proclaiming good news, release, and letting the oppressed go free, and who gave his life to loose the chains of death. If our understanding of our faith does more to restrict life than make life more abundant and free, then we have missed the point. On a December night in 1972, Eastern Airlines Flight 401 was on its way from New York to Miami. It was getting close to its destination when suddenly it crashed into the Everglades. 101 people were killed. Now, often in an accident like this, there is an equipment malfunction that leads to the great tragedy. And in a way, there was. An indicator light had gone out, and the pilots and the crew could not determine if their landing gear was properly deployed. They switched the plane to autopilot, and they worked to prepare the light. But at some point, moving around the cockpit, one of the pilots accidentally knocked the autopilot switch, turning it off. It was dark, with no view of the landscape to give direction, and no one was at the controls to know the elevation. So while everyone was focused on repairing a light, the plane descended at 2,000 feet per minute until the whole thing ended in horror. Where is our focus? What is the point of all that we do as those who call ourselves followers of Jesus? If it is to exert control over the culture and individual lives in a way that will somehow, we think, lead them to righteousness, then maybe we may be focusing on the wrong thing. We may be missing the point and the real opportunity in front of us. Today, our congregation is presenting our first graders with Bibles, and we as parents have chosen different verses with which to bless them and what we hope for them. So what is our hope for them? Is it that we will read together and memorize and all learn to fall in line? Or is it that by encountering a good word from the Lord, they will fall in love with the true heart of the God who wants to set them free? Jesus gave those gathered for worship in the synagogue that day a taste of the heart of God. It was his way of showing us where our focus should be, and that the very life we are called to live as his children is meant to reflect the heart of the God who offers abundant life and sets the world free. It was good news and good work, especially on the Sabbath. Amen.